Hey, let's take a look at what I read in June. It's been a good month. So, starting off with Stalin's Children by Owen Matthews. I did a full review of this, so you can check that out if you want to see the full review. Owen Matthews, I heard on a podcast on Planet Normal, where he was talking about the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And on that he mentioned his book Overreach, which I then went on to read, which is all about the history of Russia, Ukraine and the conflict. Looked him up in my database when I was adding that book into my Notion and discovered that I already had a book of his, which I hadn't read, so I grabbed it off the shelf and I quickly got drawn into, wow, what an amazing book. It's a memoir of his family, following starting with his grandfather, who was purged in 1937. He was killed by Stalin's regime, and it follows his mother and her sister as they go through the orphanage system in Russia and in Ukraine as they survive through the Great Patriotic War. And then we follow the story also of his father, who was a Welsh journalist / student who ended up as a student of Russian language and going to the Soviet Union, going to Russia in Soviet times, and he fell in love with Owen Matthews' mother and then had a long multi-year battle to be allowed to marry her. And as a student of Russian history and language and literature, this is just right up my street. I particularly enjoyed the sections where Owen Matthews himself ends up working in Moscow in the 90s, which was when I went to Moscow in the mid-90s. It was the only time I've been there twice. That's a lie. First time I went was in the mid-90s, and then spent a year in Ukraine, in Odessa, so it was relatable to me in that sense, because I was there. But some of the stuff this guy saw, an incredible book. If you are at all interested in that region, I definitely recommend this to you. So, next up, Nervous Conditions by Tsitsi Dangarembga. This was recommended to me by Katie Lumsden over on her channel Books and Things. I did a 1-year anniversary video on my channel and I asked some of my favourite booktubers for a recommendation, and this was Katie's. Very, very good book. Not the kind of book I would have picked up myself, so I'm grateful that I put out that call for recommendations. And it led to this amazing coming-of-age story set in Africa, and it follows the main character as she grows up in, is it Ghana? Zimbabwe. Of course, yeah, Rhodesia. She grows up as a young girl in a family who are not so well off, but they have a well-off uncle who's educated in England, and she ends up going to be brought up by that family, and she gets educated herself, which, is not something everyone gets in that region. And so we get a kind of conflict between the well-off family where she's raised and her own family living out as, in the kind of poverty-stricken areas of the country. And we get a lot about the politics of the day and about the way that education is kind of weaponized in some ways. It was such an amazing character study. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's the first of 3, turns out. So it is something I would like to follow up on at some point, to see how this young girl gets on as she gets older and lives her life through difficult conditions and difficult times. It's set in the 60s and 70s, which I was around for some of, but I don't really remember. I wasn't tuned into the news at the time, so I remember Rhodesia being in the news, but that was that. So yeah, recommend it, and I gave it 4 stars and enjoyed the audiobook narrated by Chipo Chung. So there we go. Next up, I've been reading Anna Karenina with Henry Elliott on his Substack. So we're going through this very slowly, as it would have been published originally in the Russian Messenger journal. And through that, I discovered that he was doing a reading of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf on the 18th of June, which apparently is Dallow Day. And I'd never read it. I had it on the shelf. I'd had it on the shelf for 30 years, maybe longer. And so I thought, yeah, let's read that with Henry. And the idea is that you read it in one day, and he set up a timeline of what chapters we were going to read at what times of day. And then he went round London and was filming at the locations in the book and putting them out on his Substack. It was just such an amazing experience. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed the book, actually. For those that don't know, it's a stream of consciousness as a kind of genre, and it follows Mrs. Dalloway as she plans a party. So at the beginning of the book, she goes out into London to buy flowers, and then we follow her around as she prepares to host a big party at her house in Bloomsbury, posh bit of London. And yeah, it was just such an enjoyable read. It's a read that I could actually see myself doing every year on Dallow Day, because I don't think once is enough for this kind of beautiful prose. I had read one of her books probably more than 30 years ago, which is what led to me buying this one. So I did read The Voyage Out, and it was just after my year abroad when I was in Ukraine. I think it was when I got back in 96. So you're not quite 30 years then, close. Got back from Ukraine in 96, and I'd spent that year reading a lot of English literature in Ukraine, borrowed from the British Council Library. And when I got home, I carried that on. So that's when I got that book from Virginia Woolf, and then followed up by buying this and proceeding not to read it until this month. And it cost me £4.25. Books were cheaper then. So what did I give it? Mrs. Dalloway, 4 stars, and I did a tandem read with it. So on Spotify, audiobook narrated by Anjali Mohindra. So there we go, Mrs. Dalloway. Next up, one of my favourite authors, Stephen King. I looked up my Storygraph stats to see my all-time favourite authors, and this author was running neck and neck with Stephen R. Donaldson, who wrote the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, amongst other things. So now, having read this, puts Stephen King into the lead. So I bought this for £1 in a charity shop, and it's been sitting on my shelf for a few months, not 30 years. And I kept seeing it as I walked out, because that's my shelf there. And I do look at those books every time I go in and out the room. So this was just a pure mood read. I just felt like, you know what, I'm going to have a wee look at a Stephen King book. And I ended up thoroughly enjoying this. I gave it, what did I give it? 4 stars. It's probably 4.5 actually, if I'm honest. Follows the story of a contractor who's made his millions building buildings in America, and he has a bad accident near the beginning of the novel, loses an arm, survives. It's touch and go for a while. But when he comes back to, his wife leaves him. He becomes quite violent through his trauma, and we're led to believe that he choked her at one point. He can't remember it, but she ends up leaving him, basically. And he goes to Florida to recuperate. He rents a house called Big Pink and lives on one of the Florida Keys where he takes up painting as a hobby. And his phantom limb starts to tingle, gets itching, which is a common phenomenon, I'm led to believe, in amputees. And he feels an urge to paint, so this itching, what's the word it uses? Decanted. This itching decants itself into his paintings, and he ends up becoming rather a good painter, much better than he really should be as a beginner. And during his stay there, he's recuperating from his accident, and he goes out walking on the beach. And as he approaches the neighbouring house, he sees a guy sitting out on the beach, and he sees a woman in a wheelchair, and so these are his neighbours. And it turns out that it's an elderly woman who's been looked after by a guy called Wireman. And long story short, they strike up a friendship, Wireman and Edgar, the main character, and it follows their sort of stories separately, and we get little interludes as well, where at the beginning of each chapter it's called How to Paint, and we get a little bit of backstory about, well, I shouldn't really give too much away here, should I? This is just a brief synopsis of what I've read. Long story short, he creates these wonderful paintings, and the question is, where is the inspiration coming from? Where is the ability and the talent coming from? So we get into questions of art. Why do we make art? Where does it come from? What's it all about? Is it something we should be doing to make money, or is it something that we would do even if we didn't need to? And it kind of gets into that idea. I think it's Stephen King kind of playing with these ideas himself as an artist, as a writer, who clearly doesn't need to write any more books. You know, let's face it, he's pretty well off, but he's still churning out book after book after book, and I feel like he's exploring that a bit in this novel. And it had a good ending. Sometimes King doesn't land his novels terribly well, I would say, but this one, yeah, it's great. Really, really loved it, and I'm enjoying very much going through the Kingslingers podcast, which I've listened to some of their Dark Tower series podcasts, and now I'm going through their Duma Key ones. Their discussions are fantastic. Is it Scott Daly and Matt somebody? Can't remember his name. Two guys, one of whom's a Stephen King aficionado, a constant reader, I believe is the term, and the other one is a first timer. So that's the format which I copied actually for my own Stephen Donaldson podcast, where I was going through the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant and only got as far as finishing the first one, Lord Foul's Bane. But that was where I took the inspiration for the format of that. So, yeah, this is up there with one of my favourite Stephen King novels. So there you go. Duma Key. Next up, Oblomov by Goncharov. So if you've been watching my channel for any length of time, you'll have seen a lot of stuff coming out about this book. Most of which you might have ignored if you haven't read the book, then why would you be watching my weekly chapter analyses, which were daily at one point. So this was a book I first read when I was a student, back in first year actually, at St Andrews University, where I studied Russian language and literature. And this was the only book that I read that year, and possibly through all 5 years, that I related to, certainly on such a deep level. It was the only book that I wrote a good essay on during my time there, and I wanted to take a look at why that might be. So I've been going through some of my other novels that I read during that time, which includes Anna Karenina and Crime and Punishment, which I studied last year on my channel. So I read it 2 or 3 years ago, enjoyed it immensely. It was a different translation. Yeah, this one, David Magarshak. So I read that 2 or 3 years ago. This is translated by Stephen Pearl, which I had never read. So I bought this one for a read-along and decided I was going to do it on my channel to bring people along, because it's a very underrated novel. It's not well known, certainly as much as Anna Karenina or Crime and Punishment or War and Peace. So it made sense that, because it's the one book I've related to more than any other, that I study it again, which I've thoroughly enjoyed doing. Slow reading, taking lots of notes and going through it on my channel has been very, very rewarding. The next book I read is also part of that project. The Critical Companion, which contains a collection of essays by different people going into what the novel is about and ideas of what inspired it and what it means. So, yeah, that was an interesting read as part of my Oblomov studying. So, 6 books. The last one, a poetry book, no less. I've been following Len Pennie on her social media for a while. She does Scots Word of the Day on her Instagram. I'm obviously a Scotsman, so, you know, I know the language very well. I studied it as part of my master's degree in Bradford, and I did a sociolinguistics essay on the Scots language with the title of Oor-Wullie, Does Oor-Wullie Speak English? So Oor-Wullie is a cartoon character who was published in the Sunday Post newspaper every week, along with the Bruins, and it was a Scots cartoon character. So my question was to do with the Scots language. In other words, is it a language or is it a dialect? And it's very much a language. Len Pennie writes in the Scots language. Not all of the poems are Scots, but a large, maybe half of them, maybe more than half. A poetry is something that I want to read more of, which is why I'm reading Mary Oliver's A Poetry Handbook, and I've been reading through some Anna Akhmatova poetry in Russian and in translation. But I do struggle with poetry. This, I have to say, is the first poetry book that I pulled off the shelf and just got from the very beginning. The first one I read it in Waterstones and Air. In fact, I saw it on the shelf in Waterstones and Air and ended up buying it after having just read a couple of poems, because it just spoke to me, you know. And I read it on the way home, sitting on the ferry, beautiful sunny day, sitting out on the top deck of the MV Alfred, which is a catamaran, coming back to Arran, and yeah, it was an experience, you know. So I would like to read one out to you, if you would indulge me. This one I hadn't read until this week, and it's written in the Scots language, so I'll do the best I can and see how you get on. It's called The Year I Shouldna Hae Had. Can yous lend me your ears for a toty wee sec, and I'll gie yous a story of mine. It isna hour long, and I promise to skip all the parts that were there to fill time. But I feel that as Christmas and Hogmanay's hour and we've all just went back to being sad, I should share with you all my thoughts on a year that I honestly shouldna hae had. At the start of the year, as days were gae dark and the shadows were all I could see, I thought to mysel, as mony as did, that life didna haud mair for me. I gied up, surrendered, let go of the rope and forgot who it is that I was. There's no braw wee way to describe how I felt, but there's millions of people like us. Though in feeling as darkness and numbness and guilt, sympathetic to apathy's cause, it's fechting wi' black dogs you're wanting to win, lying down to be caught in their jaws. But haud on, I'm here, I'm alive just about, and dinna intend to be deed. I'll fech my way through the same way as you, and dae battle each day with my heed. Now, I'm no religious, but just on the off chance the wee man is biding up there, here's a wee play for me for all them like us as depressed wee atheists' prayer. Mate, gie us a horn up out of this mess, gie us a toty head start, gie us a second to catch our breath and regain control of our heart. Ken, I'd love if I could relax, sleep and smile, take care of mysel and eat. I dinna want much, for I'm easily pleased and my heart's quite content just to beat. So for Abdi listening wha kens how I feel and bides in the darkness wi' me, we 1 year a hint as we look to the next and dinna ken all that we see. But you just like me survived all the things that life tried to tack and turn bad. I pray that I'll see yous all next Hogmanay, another year that we shouldn't hae had. I said this all last year, I'm back once again, 'cause I've fun my way through 1 more year. And aye, it was difficult, painful and lang, and it gied me the bulk and the fear. I lost some great people, I miss them each day, and I'll always hae my own regret. But as Papa would say, if he seen me the day, it'll all work its own self out, pet. So I'll see yous all next year, I promise yous this, just the same way as day follies nicht. We'll see you in another, just twa brookit bairns held together with duct tape and spite. Yes, 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 I relate to it so well. So that was Len Pennie's Poyums. I will be buying her follow-up, which I believe is available now, or if not now, then soon. And I'll be dipping in and out of this because it's just great. So there we go. That's my summary of what I read in June. It's been a great month. Let's hope July is just as good. See you later.